Good morning everyone, this is Richee Javier, and today's video I'm going to discuss to you about the bilingualism and gestures. The bodily movements we perform when we express ourselves are part of our linguistic and communicative behavior, and therefore a number of theoretical issues that apply to the study of bilingualism in the spoken domain also apply to the multimodal behaviors of bilinguals.
Psycholinguistic and sociolinguistic aspects of language acquisition, use, and loss in production and comprehension, issues of cross-linguistic interaction, language mixing, and code switching. To clarify the terminology and focus at the outset, this chapter discusses gesture used in child and adult speakers with knowledge or more than one language. In the study of adults in particular, a distinction is often made between second language learners or users and functional bilinguals, resting on differences in acquisition history, proficiency, or fluency in a foreign or second language. Although the majority of studies reviewed are of second or foreign language speakers, because their gesture practices have received most attention, the term bilingual is adopted throughout in order to include as much of the literature as possible. Furthermore, no distinction is made between bi or multilingual speakers. Let us now study the connection between gestures, speech, and language. So, what are gestures? Contemporary gesture studies use the term gesture to refer to visible action that can be construed as being part of an utterance or actions that have the features of manifest deliberate expressiveness. This definition excludes much of what is called nonverbal behavior, such as pupil dilation or proxemics, since these behaviors are not characterized by deliberate expressiveness. Gesture study also often exclude practical action on real objects from study and self-grooming movements such as scratching. The remaining movements, called gestures, can be performed by many articulators such as the head, the eyebrows. We find gestures like the thumbs up sign, pointing, cupping your hands when talking about the ball, or beating your hands in rhythm with stressed elements in speech. Gestures vary along several dimensions, such as their dependency on co-occurring speech, the degree to which they have linguistic properties, their degree of conventionalization, and their semiotic status. Conventionalized gesture, alternatively referred to as emblems, quotable, or autonomous gestures, function like words or idiomatic expression and are culture and language specific. For example, the ring gesture, index finger and thumb touching to form a ring. It means okay, good, worthless, or money, depending on where you are from. The forms, meanings, and usage of patterns of emblem must be learned just like words when entering a culture or language. Less or no conventional gestures are often called just gestures, co-speech gestures, or gesticulation. Although they lack standards of well-performedness, these gestures are tightly linked to speech and language. Finally, all gestures have formal, structural properties with articulatory phases whose details depend on articulators, which is hands and arms, the place of articulation, space on the body, and the movement. In addition, gestures have complex functional properties since they are deeply multifunction and have both other directed functions. Example, turn regulation, attention direction, and self-directed functions. Example, organizing thought, often simultaneously. In contemporary gesture research, speech and co-speech gestures are increasingly seen as an integrated whole which is planned and processed together in comprehension, production, and development. Although the precise details of the speech-gesture relationship is under theoretical debate. Example, the exact role of imagery, linguistic influences, and communicative intentions, the latest point of interaction in the encoding process. It is generally agreed that speech and gestures are connected at the conceptual level. The integration is seen in multiple ways. For instance, gestures improve speech comprehension both in ambiguous and unambiguous contexts. They are also integral to speech production as revealed in the mutual influence of the modalities whereby the content and fluency of speech is affected by the presence or absence of gesture. The modalities further developing parallel in childhood and break down together in disfluency and shattering. Speech and gesture are also deployed together in the interaction in sophisticated ways. Speakers distribute information across the modalities differently depending on whether knowledge is shared, on visibility conditions, on spatial orientation, and on whether speakers are engaged in monologue or dialogue. In social practices, speech and gestures interact in complex ways to regulate speakerhood, turn-taking, and other aspects of conversation. Finally, the speech-gesture integration has neural underpinnings. For example, Broca's area, implicated in language processing, is also activated when we observe the gestures of others. Speech and gesture are also processed as one signal in comprehension as revealed in electrophysiological measures of integration difficulties when speech and gesture are incongruent with the preceding context. Now let us also study about the culture and language-specific gestural repertoires in production. People are generally convinced that people from different cultures gesture differently. Although the preconceived ideas do not always match empirical facts, different cultural and linguistic communities do in fact display systematic between group differences and within group consistencies in gestural usage, patterns, and forms, leading to different gestural repertoires. In a pioneering study, Efron examined the gesture of so-called Southern Italians and Eastern European Jews and first and second generation population in New York. Efron first outlined three different typical gestural repertoires for Italian, Yiddish, and American English speakers based on movements, pattern, and use of gesture space. He then showed that the level of cultural integration determined whether second-generation speakers displayed the gestural repertoires of the original group, which is Italian or Yiddish, or of the surrounding majority culture, which is the American English. Although not conceived of a study of bilingualism, it nevertheless highlights the cross-modal effects of cultural and linguistic shift in bilingualism. Many aspects of gestural practices are cultural in nature, such as emblems, norms for polite gestures use, how to point appropriately, and typical size of gesture, what hand to use, whether to indicate the feature in front of or behind you. Importantly, for linguistic studies of bilingualism, the properties of language itself also affect gesture. There is a growing body of work showing that the form and distribution of gestures differ cross-linguistically depending on semantic, syntactic, and discursive organization. Gestures are vehicles of meaning and typically align with focus or newsworthy information in non-adherence. Insofar as languages differ in how they organize meaning morphosyntactically in discourse, accompanying gestures will reflect such differences. For instance, an English speaker may express both manner of motion, run, and the path of the movement across. In a single spoken clause, he ran across the street and perform a single lateral gesture. In contrast, French speakers must distribute this information over spoken to clauses. He crossed the street running, often accompanied by one gesture per clause, such as lateral gesture cross, followed by a manner gesture run. Gesture thus reflect information considered relevant for expression, what to say, as well as its linguistic encoding, how to say it, with cross-linguistic consequences. These gestural facts raise new questions for bilingualism concerning cross-modal cultural and linguistic practices and development and usage. How are gestures studied? Gestures display as much individual variation as speech, and the same sensitivity to variation in linguistic and social contexts and psychosocial factors. And just as speech, gestures are studied using a range of different methodologies ranging from free observation in naturalistic settings to tightly controlled experimental procedures across different tasks. As in other areas of bilingualism studies, both quantitative and qualitative approaches are useful. Importantly, because gesture production is not categorical in nature, sometimes speakers gesture and sometimes they do not. Data are typically treated in terms of preferences and probabilities. Now let's proceed to the bilingual children and gestures. Gestures play a key role in child language development in general and therefore also in early bilingualism. From the very first moments of interaction, caretakers provide infants with both spoken and gestural input when they direct attention to and label objects and action, elaborate on the functions of objects. Since caretakers use their language and culture-specific gestural repertoires, this means that bilingual children have a richer multimodal communicative environment than monolingual children. Gesture production in early simultaneous bilingualism has received some attention, especially the question of whether bilingual children use gesture to compensate for speech to a greater extent than their bilingual peers. It is a widespread assumption that because gesture can convey meaning, they can also stand in for words or expressions in cases of expressive difficulties or lexical gap. There is also a theoretical suggestion that iconic gesture production is motivated by lexical retrieval mechanism by cross-modal priming. Both views lead to the prediction that bilingual children should produce more gestures in the weaker than the stronger language under the assumption that lexical retrieval is more difficult in bilingual than in monolingual production. If gestures are used as a compensatory device, bilingual children may also express meanings in gestures that are not present in speech. However, in a series of studies, Nicolaides and her colleagues have shown parallel development in speech and gesture also in bilingual children. For instance, Canadian French, English bilingual children between age 2 and 4 produce longer utterances with iconic gesture which depict the content of speech than when they do not gesture at all or produce rhythmic beat-like gesture. A few studies finally have also considered bilingual children's comprehension of gestures in the input. Overall, surprisingly, few studies systematically investigate gestures in bilingual children's input, output, and multilingual language development. Both form of psycholinguistic and an interactional viewpoint, it is important to develop a firmer understanding of bilingual children's multimodal development, especially from age 3 onwards into later childhood. Virtually nothing is known about multimodal developmental routes and rates in bilingual children and about what roles dominance, types of linguistic structures, sociolinguistics, settings, and so on play for such development. That's all for today. Thank you and God bless.